So we're waiting now for the photocopy for Vlados Kodshim, which we started yesterday in Akdom of Tmura. So we're waiting for you, Gimel. Okay. So those pages maybe that we have, maybe put it on the side so we don't get confused. Thank you, thank you. Okay. He says the following. Arbanos sheyoldu. So you have a carbon that gave birth. Arev Lodosam, Kedoshim v'Kedushas Imam. We're going to derive from a pasuk that that the Vlad picks up the kedusha of the mother because it says v'imzevach shlamim karbano im min abakar hu makriv im zachar im nikev. We said that extra phrase of im zachar im nikev is a ribui. Amim yakrivenu lifnei Hashem. What do we derive from these seemingly redundant words im zachar im nikeva? Zachar is marbed of Vlad. He doesn't tell you what we're going to derive from the cave, but from the word Zachar, we're going to derive the Vlad. He has an alternative drasha from a pasuk in Parshas Re'eh, Rak Kodshecha asher yu lecha unidarecha tisa uvas el hamakom sheyivcha Hashem. And the extra words asher yu lecha are coming to be marbed of Vlad. And the first question that arises in the mind is whether or not the Vlad has the identical kedusha as the mother. Are there any differences between the mother and the Vlad? And another issue that's going to come up is whether or not the law and the status of Vlad Kodshim applies equally to all karbanos. So, for example, we're going to start with Vlados of Shlomim. So the Chachamim hold that the Vlad of Shlomim has the status of Shlomim. It's identical to the mother, and therefore it's brought as a korban Shlomim. And that's l'chatchila. I mean, we have no inhibitions about that. Whereas Rabbi Elazar says, wait a minute, Gazu bechacham shelo yikare, shelo yakov. What is the nature of this gzeira? Gzeira shema mitoch sheyesh lebaylim hano mifladoseo ishe es ha'em v'lo yakriva ad shetele kama v'lodos. It would make sense the owner of the mother of the animal that's a zebach to delay bringing the karban, because in the meantime the mother could produce vlados, and those vlados could also be brought as a korban shlom. So why not wait for a while and get more benefit from the vlados? So what's the problem? What are we dealing with? Balti Acher? Is that it? He says, V'yigdal mehem adorim adorim. V'yovel idei iser giza v'avoda v'kodshim. It's a little bit terse here, he gives you sometimes in this Hakdama, just a short abridged version. Nachum, let's go over this one more time and see if we can decipher it. According to the Chachamim, we're not worried about any problems here. And the Vlad of the Kodshim in this case of Shlomim, is Karev Shlomim. That makes sense. That's what we derive from any of those drushes that we mentioned. Blaza has Xera D'Rabban. As a result of Xera, we're going to give the Vlad a din of Misa. Like we spoke once about Chatos HaMesos, just lock it up until it dies. And this is apparently a sugya in Tvura Daf Yud Zayin. That's the impression I get from the footnotes. So now, why does Rabbi Lazar object to bringing the Vlad as a Shlomim, which he agrees on a Deraisa level, it should be so. And the Rabbanan are worried about the fact that if the owner of the Kodshim, or the mother, is going to get benefit from the Vlados, he's going to delay the process of bringing the mother as a korban. He's going to wait for the mother to produce many Vlados, which in the language of the Gemara apparently is Yigadol Mehen Adorim Adorim. Okay, fine. So what's so terrible in that? That's what we're trying to figure out. And he adds here, apparently quoting Rashi in Tvura Daf Yud Ches, Yovali de Itzer Giza Vavoda B'Kodshim. So again, I'm going to try to take a shot at this. Eventually, he knows that the Vlados have to be brought on the Mizbeach. I'm not going to assume that he's totally ignorant of that fact. But he's got a bunch of Vlados running around, an Eder, a whole flock, of Karbanos, young Karbanos. And maybe he won't realize that this one is a Vlad of a Kodshim and this one is not a Vlad of a Kodshim. There'll be a whole confusion over here. Or alternatively, as he's waiting for this whole process is concerned, maybe somebody, maybe not him, but one of his shepherds or one of his employees will start cutting off the wool off the back of the animal, might even work with the animal, not realizing that it's Kodshim. It's interesting because in theory, you could have a whole flock of animals and you could be Magdish all of them, be 1,000 of them. But in this case, where it's the next generation, so that, there's going to be a whole delay in which he's trying to produce a whole flock of let's call it sheep or calves, whatever it might be. And at some point, like there's going to be what we call a ketzer, there's going to be like a breakdown. People are not going to realize, hey, all these little calves are really Kodshim. They're Kodesh B'Kedushas Korban. Amrav Shimilo Nechleku al Vlad uvlad Shlomim. El Vlad uvlad Tvura. Shelo Yikarik. So if we're talking about the third generation, then according to Rabbi Shimon at least, even the Chachamim agreed to this prohibition. This is a very unusual situation because Rabbi Shimon is a Tana, and he is interpreting the scope, and in this case, he's limiting the scope of the Machlokas Tanoim. That's something that you see in the Gemara amongst the Amoraim. So it seems that, according to Rabbi Shimon, the Chachamim are going to be more mekil regarding the first generation than the second generation. Because again, once you get to the second generation, I guess there's a greater chashash that people don't realize that all these, this whole flock of calves, they're all Kodshim. The first generation, the Chachamim insist, first generation that's born to the original carbon, the mother, Shlomo, that first generation, everybody knows that's Kodshim. No one's going to mess around with Giza and Avoda and violate the Kedushas carbon. Lassa thinks that even the first generation is a problem. Maybe the calf, maybe the cow will give birth to many calves.
And the rest of the solution, put it in the secret island, that's Kodshim island, that's it. That's not the whole big problem. You put it into a separate island, there's all Kodshim island here. It's like it's born, goes into there.
Yeah, but I guess, during the breeding process, maybe you say put a fence around it or something like that.
Separate. I mean, that's
I guess we're not going to rely, according to Lazar at least, we're not going to rely on a person to do that. See, a proliferating Kodshim, which you and I would have said, well, that's a good thing. Let's bring Russian. Every Shlomo is
generation.
right, and that's what he's worried about. He's saying that if you're going to keep breeding and proliferating Kodshim, at some point things can get a little bit sticky, a little bit, we say, confusing, and people are going to start violating Giza Avodas. I was thinking, why not just take a red coloring mark and mark each one with an X? Maybe that would make it a balmum. I don't know. I don't think so. Now, on top of this, we still have to clarify what Reb Shimon has in mind. We're still not 100% sure about Reb Shimon. Again, just the words of Reb Shimon is that in the first generation of the Vlad, right, that's where we have a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. The Chachamim, according to Rabbi Shimon, would accept the Gzera of Rabbi Elazar in the next generation. Wow. So now we have Machlokes Rabbah and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. So let's go over to the left column here on page Gimel. Ladas Rabbah, Pirush Divrei Rabbi Shimon, Shebevlad Avlad, in the next generation, Moder Rabbi Elazar lechachamim, Shu Karev Shlamim. I'm going to skip this for a moment, just to get to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and then we'll go back to Rabbah. According to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Vlad Avlad, Modim Chachamim l'Rabbi Elazar she'enu karev. That's the way we understood it. Because again, once you're getting to the third generation, the grandchildren, it's really getting out of hand, and we're not able to, control and supervise to make sure that every single third generation animal is recognized to be Kodshim, and it deserves, and it's designated for the Mizbeach. Lefisha mitoch ma'asav nikar shekavanosa l'gadel adorim adorim. Sharei hiniaches avlad laholid gam hu vlad. He is delaying the process of bringing the Kodshim to even produce a third generation. Look how long of a period of time in which he's breeding it and creating, the next generation is going by. And therefore, afilu chachamim shelo gazu b'stam modim hem b'ofen zeh shekavanosa l'gadel is once we get to the third generation, that's indicative of the fact that he's really growing and breeding these animals. Is yesh ligzar shelo yikaret. Interesting. Here the language of shelo yikaret. Before he used a language of Isser Gizav Avod. It's a slightly different language, but basically lo yikarev, I think, means that it'll lose track of the fact that this is a behemoth's kodshim. It's been so long, delaying the process of bringing the kodshim. He's breeding the first generation, which is the mother that was designated as a korban shalom. And then he produced the next generation, and then he's still delaying because he wants to get from the second generation a whole third generation, a whole Eider of little calves or little shepseles. And at some point, maybe he won't be makriv, and all these bloodouts are Kodesh L'Mizbeach. So that's Rabbi Shimon Levi. And that's what we thought based on, the original paragraph on the bottom of the right column. Now, Rav is going to turn everything inside out, upside down. Rava says, again, this is all Rabbi Shimon's interpretation of Rabbi Elazar Chacham, that in the case of a vlad, Rabbi Elazar is going to be modeh to the Chachamim and remove the Gzeira. When we get to the third generation, there is no Gzeira. Take the third generation and bring it on the Mizbeach. Don't lock it up and wait till it dies. Lefisha bevlad avlad, ein adam zocher shemikarban shlomim huba. Oh boy, now I'm really thrown for a loop. I'm afraid that this proves that what I said before is wrong. Lefisha bevlad avlad, ein adam zocher shemikarban shlomim huba. Think what's going on here, I hope I'm not off base here, is that at some point it's public knowledge that this was designated as a korban shlom, which means we have to be very careful with it to make sure it gets onto this path. No longer does anyone think that this is a vlad of Kodshim Mizbeach. They can identify it, and they will identify it as an original korban shlom. What do we gain by that? The ein ligzar shema yiru acherim shemakriv esavlad v'yavo lahashos es karbanom ad sheyeldu kama vlodos. So Rabbi Elazar is focused on the first generation. That's where he insists on the Gzeira. Why? Because with regard to the first generation, if we allow the first generation to be brought on the Mizbeach, then he's going to be tempted to delay bringing the first generation on the Mizbeach for the purpose of producing an Eider, producing a third generation. It's almost as if, but again, I'm sure it's much more profound than what I'm saying. It's almost as if once it's a Vlad Kodshim, according to Rabbi Elazar, you recognize it as such. So you get the impression, hey, you know what? If the Torah said that even the Vlad Kodshim is Karev, as is, why not produce another generation of Vlad Kodshim? But at some point, according to Rava, we recognize, we've already long forgotten that this is a Vlad of Kodshim. We recognize and assume that this is an original. It's not a Vlad. And if it's an original, then we'll certainly bring it on the Mizbeach. The problem of delaying only exists when you identify it as a Vlad Kodshim. When you, again, there's a piece of the puzzle missing. I'm just trying to fill it in with some, psychological svara here, that in the Vlad Kodshim, you're saying, well, the Torah said, the next generation is also Kodshim. So why not take advantage of that and generate a third generation? The Torah's already given me one Vlad. Now I want to create a Vlad from the Vlad. And at some point, you have this proliferation of so many korbanos. But if I don't have the mindset that this is a Vlad korban, then paradoxically, there's no room for the Gzeira. Why? Because then my only other option is that this is an original korban. And we never made a Gzeira with regard to an original korban, that he's going to delay and then somebody will come and forget that it's a korban. That we never had. Only when we have a Vlad Kodshim, which he's tempted to take this Vlad and delay bringing on the Mizbeach so that he can produce the next generation of Vlados, that's where Rabbi Elazar has the Gzeira. But I'm just wondering, according to Rabbi, at what point did the Chachamim agree to Rabbi Shimon? 1 second. The Vlad mode Rabbi Elazar l'Chacham. Oh, I think I understand what's going on here. The machlokas in between Rabbi and Rabbi Shimon Levi is who was molded to whom? Was Rabbi Elazar molded to the Chachamim L'Kula, that we don't have to wait till it dies, but rather we could bring it? Or alternatively, was it the Chachamim that are molded to Rabbi Elazar L'Chumra and they accepted this Gzeira? We're not going to bring it on the Mizbeach. So initially, when we read the paragraph that introduced this sugya of Rabbi Shimon, which is the last paragraph on the right column, we assumed, like Rabbi Shimon Levi, that the Chachamim are being molded to Rabbi Elazar l'chumra, that there is a Gzeira. And Rabbi Shimon Levi, according to his understanding, is going to say that once you get to the next generation, the Vlad of the Vlad, that's where the Chachamim will admit and concede the position of the Gzeira of Rabbi Elazar, because he's already involved in this whole process of multiplying the Vlados and breeding them. And at some point, they're going to forget that it's the next generation, and it's all Kodshim, it's all Vlad Kodshim, and then they're going to come to violate the Isurim. But according to Rabbah, it's just the opposite. Rabbi Elazar is moded the Chachamim that there is no Gzeira. Why not? Adarabah, as we just saw in Rabbi Shimon Levi, the more you get to Vlad of Vlad, the more it's indicative of the fact that he wants to keep proliferating, and at some point we're going to have such a massive amount of Kodshim that he would be tempted, or somebody would be tempted, to tamper with the Kodshim, Shalom Kilachas, whether it's Giza or Avodah. No, says Rabbah, just the opposite. When do we have this fear that he's delaying the whole process of bringing the korban and he's breeding more and more and more? That's only as long as we remember to identify that this is a Vlad Kodshim. Now we're going to assume that if he's delaying bringing the Vlad Kodshim, it's the reason he's doing so is because he wants to produce massive amounts. But somehow, paradoxically, says Rabbah, if we identify this as Kodshim but not as Vlad Kodshim, then we don't have the Gzeira. Because then we go back to the original state of Kodshim. And that's what he's saying, Vlad Vlad Einodem Zocher. Nobody remembers the history of this korban. They think that if it's got that red X on it, it's because somebody was mafresh it as a korban shlamim. But if in the first generation, that's where Rabbi Elazar has the Gzeira, because once you're at the generation of a Vlad and you identify it as such, you know, and you remind yourself, you remember that this is a Vlad Kodshim, then if we allow you to benefit from that Vlad Kodshim by breeding it and producing another generation, you're going to chas v'shalom violate the Isa Kedushas code. Yesh min harishonim shekosav shel das Rabbi Shimon Levi shalosh shitos bedom. Shebedas chachamim shevlad shlomim karev. Right, we said that the machlokas between chachamim and Rabbi Elazar, according to Rabbi Shimon Levi, is dafka vlad shlomim, like the first generation. Because with regard to vlad, even the chachamim accept the gzeira of Rabbi Elazar, and they disqualify the vlad for the mizbeach. Nechleku Tanakam of Rabbi Shimon in vlad lo yikarev, o sha'af vlad yikarev. It doesn't tell you who holds what over here, but I think if we're going to Rabbi Shimon Levi, then we're saying that vlad lo yikarev. And that's Rabbi Shimon Levi's interpretation of Rabbi Shimon. And now he has the Tanakama that af vlad havlad yikarev. So Rabbi Shimon Levi is going to have to admit that according to at least one Tana who disagrees with Rabbi Shimon, vlad havlad is yikarev, and there is no gzeira. Adkan shlomim. Now he moves on to carbon toda. And now we have to rack our brains and figure out what's unique about a carbon toda. Vlados toda is nechleku bo rishonim. So now we want to know if the gzeira of Rabbi Elazar not to bring vlad shlomim on the mizbeach, and according to one opinion, vlad shlomim. What about vlad of a toda? Now, why should a vlad of a toda be different? O shebalad toda l'divrei hakol ein ligzor. So this comes under a principle in Drabanans of milselo shchicha lo gazur be'Rabbanan. Reish Tzadi Dalid.
So a normal person can bring it to
Only a person who fits into one of four categories, right? So he experienced the salvation. He has to bring a carbon toda. How often does that happen? So if you're down with Sfaradim, I don't know if you ever had that occasion. It's like everybody says a Birkas Hagoma, like one after the other. It's like wild. I mean, whenever there's Kriyas HaTorah, there's an average of at least, and I'm talking about a minyan of 50 people, 5 of them are saying Birkas Hagoma. But for Ashkenazim, at least, it's rare, somewhat rare. I can't even remember the last time I benched Shkomen. Maybe because I got off a flight, but I haven't been traveling that much lately. So he's saying that we have a principle that we don't impose a gzeira on a milselo shchich.
So what's this between the shlomim and the toda?
Shlomim is everybody brings a shlom. Yeah, it's ma'asim b'chol yom. You know, it's your turn to bring a shlom. Like everybody volunteers to bring a shlom. You can't volunteer to bring a toda, so you have to be in one of those categories. You know, you took a trip through the wilderness, so that's not the shchia. Right. You know, it's interesting, you know, in our day, tell me if you agree with this, wine, for most people, I think, is mevushal. And yayin mevushal does not come under stam yeno. So if a guy, let's say, moves a bottle of wine that's already been pasteurized, then there's no issue. So Rabbi Feinstein says, because milselo shchicha lo gazur be'Rabbanan. It's really interesting. In other words, the whole issue of stam yenom is only exerted Rabbanan. The Gemara says mishum chasnas, you know, that we shouldn't mix with them and drink wine with them and so forth and so on. So it comes out that most of our wines, according to Moshe's understanding, are called milselo shchicha. But today, I think it's more shchiach to have I mean, again, most wine connoisseurs will drink unpasteurized, but like dry wine and so. Vlad hatoda hakarev, amim shuton lechem upam she'ein tom. Oh, so this touches on the question I asked at the beginning, whether or not the vlad of a carbon has the identical status as the carbon. And with regard to a carbon toad, you have to accompany it with 40 lechamim, right? 30 of which are matzah and 10 of which are chametz. So now he's wondering, what's the status of the vlad of toad? That also requires the accompaniment of the lechem. Im haisa toda todas chova arei adin choluk b'zeh beinim kvar hikru b'todas chovaso, and then ein avlad toda lechem beinim adayin lo hikru es todas chovaso shareu ton lechem. Im haisa toda todas nedavel liolam ein avlad ton lechem. So be honest with you, David, I have to correct what I told you before. I told you that there's no such thing as a todas nadal, but now I see I'm wrong. So it's a pellet to me that you can be misnaded in carbon toda. But any event, a carbon toda bin nadava is radically different than a carbon todas chova in that it doesn't require the lachne toda. Only a carbon todas chova requires lachne. Now, when you get to the vlad, how do you define it? Is it a todas chova or not? And he says it all depends on whether or not he brought his toda. This reminds us of all the sugyas that we had about chatos. Shenis kapu balel, right? He lost the chatos. In the meantime, he brought a different replacement chatos. That's what we have here. Okay, then so let's make a note of where we got up to. We're up to Vlados Tmura. Then. So how many copies did you make, John? 2?
And made 3.
3? Oh, so if you have one extra copy for me, yeah? Okay, great, because that saves me the schlep with the Gemara back and forth. And also, I think it's a good idea that I leave the Gemara here, because, wait a second. So, David, you have this page? You have. Okay, so this is an extra one. We'll put it on the side. And this will bring my little